Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Professor Davis Says, where anybody can be a historian. I am Professor Davis. This episode, we're going to talk about the founders of HBCUs. Okay, the founders of HBCUs. Now, these individuals come from a gambit of backgrounds, ethnic flavors, and cultural diversities. Okay, the first we want to talk about is the Black church. All right. People who were congregants of the Christian faith who served in various capacities, but they saw a need for African Americans to be educated. Okay, the other part to this founders portion are people who worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, which was an agency that was in control of helping to establish African Americans with a better foot on the ground, if you will, in the post-slavery days, or right during the time slavery ended. Okay, and the third part of these founders are a group of Caucasians, European Americans, who had the best interest in mind for the same two causes of the same two previous groups that I just mentioned. Okay, so you had, again, Black congregants, or the Black church. You had missionaries from other churches, these European Americans, Caucasians, who were also philanthropists, by the way, who were also landowners, who were also people who were either affluent or just had that sense of mind to give back and to see and to help African Americans seek success by view being free. And of course, the Freedmen's Bureau. All right, those were all members of different groups that were founders of HBCUs. Now, of course, many people don't realize that HBCUs are, some of them, not all of them, are named after African Americans. Some are named after European Americans or Caucasian. And so before I get into that too much, just wanted to let you all know that founders of HBCUs, you'll be surprised when you see the schools, individual schools, educational entities, and higher education. When you look at their history pages and you see, okay, you kind of get a glimpse of images of their founders. And, a lot of people probably will be taken back by that when they see, wow, a lot of Caucasian men were behind the scenes helping to work out and to help carve a path for freedom, using education as a vehicle for people who were former slaves. And this was one of the ideas for having an HBCU, or historically Black College and University. All right. And for those who don't know, the founders of HBCUs, whether it's Richard Allen, who was a member of the AME Church, he was one of their founders. All right. So this is important moving forward. Now, the other thing that I want to mention to you is that, how these institutions, how were they sustained? How did they thrive 180 years ago, or 150 years ago, or, 100 or even 50 years ago? Okay, so it kind of goes back to the enrollment. Most HBCUs are enrollment driven. Many HBCUs are land grant institutions where the federal funds were put in place by the government through land grants. And so there was a mechanism set up in place for all colleges, but in particular, there's an act, and that was called the Second Morrill Act of 1890. Again, Google that, the Second Morrill Act of 1890. But there was a first Morrill Act, of course, that was written by a representative by the name of Justin Morrill, who was, I believe, from Vermont. All right, if I'm not corrected, he was from Vermont, who initially wrote this platform out, this plan, this process out for every state that was in the Union at that time. Okay, just before the Civil War, when the original bill was written, I think in 1855. And then, of course, it went up again in 1857, and then again in 1862, where it finally was approved by Abraham Lincoln before he was assassinated. But this bill, this act, if you will, this Morrill or Second Morrill, there's a first Morrill Act and a second Morrill Act. Okay, the first Morrill Act was in 1862. The second, which is more aligned with these HBCUs, folks, the second Monroe Act was in 1890, and Congress signed that one. Now, the difference between the two was that the second one was predicated towards former Confederate states in the South. This is why you have a number of HBCUs that are geographically centered in the southern portion of the United States. Okay, but remember, HBCUs, these black colleges, got their foundations in the North at Wilberforce, okay, in Ohio, and also at Cheney University just outside of Philadelphia. Of course, another one we all know is Lincoln University. Yes, named after guess who? Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so again, so we just want to kind of, tie that into the subject when it comes to talk about founders. All right, more predicated towards these land grant institutions in the southern United States. But the one clause that was to that was that these colleges cannot discriminate racially, or I would say ethnically discriminate against people who attended, people who enrolled in these colleges. I know some of y'all scratching your heads like, wow, that's still going on today, more or less in a legal sense. And just because it's legal doesn't make it moral. All right. So back then, in the between 1862 and 1890, there was a lot of, misappropriation of different mechanisms on how people were involved in being members of different schools. And so that came to a close, or was more marginalized, when you had that second Moral Act of 1890, where it was pretty much against the law to discriminate based on skin color, all right, based on your ethnicity, to attend schools. And of course, these schools now are HBCUs, if you have it that way. And so I want to also point out, when you're talking about how these schools were sustained over time, you had a lot of resources put in place, courtesy of the federal government, courtesy of philanthropists, courtesy of people who had the best interest in mind of seeing, at this point now, after 1865, former slaves being educated. And so a number of these institutions were named after people who were land grant owners, who donated parcels of land to various HBCUs. And for the record, the term HBCU didn't become a real term until about the mid 1960s. And we'll have time to talk about that in another episode. Okay, so as far as sustaining these organizations, these educational entities where African Americans were educated, and those educations backgrounds were, of course, with agriculture, it was with engineering, because of course when that first act was signed in 1862 by Abraham Lincoln, they had delayed it at first in the late 1850s because of the idea of this Civil War. And of course, 1862, the Civil War had been in the process of going on. And so they included engineering for people who were involved in military tactics to be educated as well. And so, there was a kind of a spat back and forth with that with various politicians. But Lincoln gave the thumbs up, and it was signed in 1862. And of course, again, the Second Morrill Act, which helped other founders for HBCUs in the latter part of the 19th century. Okay, I hope you learned something new about HBCUs and their founders. And if you did, please be sure to leave a comment in the comment section below. If you've enjoyed this channel, please get the thumbs up. Also, be sure to subscribe. And please be sure to tune in next time. And remember, Professor Davis says,